What I thought might make sense is for me to just briefly give you a little bit about how I got to where I am now, why I wrote the book, and what I hope will happen because of the book. And then we can do questions if that's what you all want. So you sort of have a little bit of my background from Tara, but it basically started with me wanting to become a cop. That didn't work out, and I went into the construction business in Boston, as most Irish guys did back in the day in Boston. And I was lucky enough to invent a method of extruding the conduit over the cable, which sort of revolutionized the way you build cable systems. And we became the largest designer and builder of cable systems in America. And then we got into a little bit of a jam where our biggest customer didn't pay us. And there's a story in the book about how I got paid, which just sort of verifies that bad judgment makes great stories, because it's a good story, but it involved me digging up the cable and taking my work back. But when I finally did get paid, I turned to my best friend at the time, a guy named Jim Finnegan, and I said, this construction business is really too hard because you have to fight to get the work. By definition, your price is wrong because you're bidding against 10 other people, and if you're the low bidder, by definition, you're probably wrong. Then you have to do the work. Then you have to fight to get paid, and you have to start all over again. And I said, we have to find a revenue recurring model. So Jim and I built the first competitive phone company in America, a company called Corporate Communications Network. We connected 2 buildings in Boston, Bank of Boston buildings, then 3, then 4. Then we connected the digital equipment buildings, then the Polaroid buildings. And then it was a little company, but we merged it into another little company called MFS to create MFS McCourt. And then we merged MFS, when we only had $256 million in revenue, we merged MFS into a bigger company for $14.5 billion. And I mentioned that big number just to show you that if you do something unique, because I think, is most everyone here, Tara, in business school, or is everyone here through the business school?
Anyone from business education here?
So I'll make this business centric. If you can do something that no one else has ever done and it's scalable, you can create a huge amount of value. So we did. Ultimately, we sold it to WorldCom, and luckily for me, I bought a put and sold a call and collared my stock, because WorldCom eventually went broke. But I had collared my stock, which was a very simple transaction. It made the front page of the Wall Street Journal as an exotic financial transaction. It wasn't exotic at all. It was actually quite simple. But it saved my ass because it collared the stock. Then I went into the Caribbean and I built a TV station, and we began to produce our own content, and we got good at it. So we started producing content in America, and then we got very good at it, as Tara mentioned, and we won a number of Emmys for that. I built the cable and phone systems in Mexico from Hermosillo to Guadalajara, where we could only afford to charge $15. At that time, we owned cable systems in the States where our average customer was paying us $135. In Mexico, our average customer was paying us $15. So we had to rethink, how do you go about selling a product at $15 and making money? So we were the first ones to, this is before you had prepaid cards, debit cards, and that sort of thing. So we made people prepay. We couldn't afford to collect for bad debt, so we made everybody pay in advance in cash. We couldn't afford to do installs. We were the first one to hand people a converter and say, take it home and figure it out yourself, because we couldn't afford to send trucks. We couldn't afford to do disconnect, so we took a big deposit and made people return their converter. We would give people a lottery ticket every time they paid their bill. So if they paid the bill on month 1, they get 1. If they paid the bill month 2, they get 2. And month 25, they get 25 lottery tickets. So no one ever left us, because once you'd been a customer for a couple of years, you were getting every month 24 lottery tickets. And we built our own lottery, and we lotteried off a house, which, if I remember right, it was something like $1,500 or $1,600 it cost us to build a 1,200 square foot house. But we'd give away a house in our lottery. And then we sold that business to Carlos Slim. I did the same thing in Europe, and I built a company called McCourt International. We sold that, to which now Verizon. We've been operating in Ireland for about 7 years. We owned a company called eNet, which was a public-private partnership with the government. We now, it says here that I'm trying to solve the world's connectivity challenges. I've been working for 5 years on just trying to get national broadband off the ground in Ireland, a country of 4 million people, and we still haven't got it off the ground yet. So we have about 198 countries left to go, and then we can declare that statement true. So that's what we do in Ireland, but it is a huge public-private partnership, which I'm very proud of, because public-private partnerships are dwindling now in Europe, and there's a reason for that, which we should probably talk about, because there's an attack on big business going on throughout the whole West, which all the young people in this room are going to have to figure out how to solve. Otherwise, politicians will solve it for you, and it will be ugly, because they're not qualified to solve it. But if you don't solve it yourself, they will attempt to solve it. So that's my background, and why I wrote the book is because from the Industrial Revolution up through the 90s, business was about incremental change. It was all about one little incremental change after another. And probably the best executive at repeating incremental change month after month after month, year after year after year, was Jack Welch. And I think his stock went up by 4,000% or something like that when he was running GE. And he was all about incremental change. And there's lots of names for it, buzzwords for it, Six Sigma, another turn of inventory, another point of EBITDA. And people actually ran their lives based on incremental change. So it wasn't only in business, it was in communities and nonprofits and educational institutions, hospitals, healthcare. The whole world worked on this basis of incremental change and constantly getting a little bit better. However, the problem is that because of the internet, because of social media, because of the way we absorb information, incremental change is not good enough, because the problems are accelerating faster than incremental change will be able to solve them. So that model that's been around for 100 years no longer works. It's dead. It will not work. And the problem is that educational institutions are still teaching people how to think in an incremental way for people that have to graduate and then go fight problems in a very entrepreneurial, revolutionary way. And most business schools, which I personally think is wrong, are teaching entrepreneurship, or most schools rather, are teaching entrepreneurship in the business school, which is the last place they need to teach it. They need to teach it in the School of Diplomacy, in the School of Nursing, in law school. They need to teach it in trade schools, because there's millions or billions of people in the world that really don't have either a lot of utility or a lot of desire to have huge amounts of money, but they do want to be successful and they do want to solve problems, and they need to think more entrepreneurially. And that's where it really should be taught, in my view, because business people, over time, they're like mice. They'll find a crumb, they'll find a piece of cheese, they'll find a way to get ahead. But people, if someone is 17 and going off to school, and they want to be a diplomat, or they want to be a healthcare professional, they want to be an artist, they want to be a carpenter, they want to be a cop like I wanted to be, they're not really thinking about making lots of money, but they still have to think differently in this world. So what I hope will happen when people read the book, I hope two things will happen when you read the book. I hope, first thing, you'll buy it for everybody for Christmas on Amazon. And repeatedly go on social media and say how much you like it. So that's the first two things I hope will happen. And the next thing I hope will happen is that people will be inspired to think more revolutionary about the big problems. And what's interesting, as businessmen and women, there's money to be made in solving the big problems. So there's an Irish expression that many of you, I'm sure, are familiar with, that, and I can't say it in Irish, but in English it says, in muck there's brass, right? Which means two things. It means in hard work you can make money, but it also means in problem, in turmoil, there's money to be made. In the big problems of society, there's money to be made. And if they don't get solved by businessmen and women, they'll get attempted to get solved by politicians, and the problems will get worse. So if we look at this from an American perspective, I try to go to 6 countries a year, but I spend about a third of my year, say, in America. But America's a good proxy to talk about these problems, because if the problems are in America, the problems are going to be in the rest of the West. So the big problems, and they come sort of in 2 different buckets. They come in one that I sort of think of as environmental, they're sort of all around us, and the other is sort of DNA, which is they're imprinted in us, and they just keep on getting repeated. So the 2 that are all around us are the environment. Coincidentally, one is the environment. So in America, we're about 4% of the world population, and we used to use about 30% of the energy. Now we've got that down to about 18%. But that's our usage that 12% decrease. About 2% is because we're using less. About 10% of it is just because other people are using more. So China's using more, so we have a smaller percentage. But because we were at 4% of the population and used 30% of the natural resources, we have to be the leader in solving that problem. We can't, this America First attitude doesn't work if we were one of the causes of the problem. So we have to be the leader on the environment, and there's lots of money to be made in solving that problem. The second problem that's almost uniquely American is obviously the guns problem, which is just like mind-boggling that problem has been around for so long, and we can't seem to solve it. And then the 3 other problems that Ireland has, England has, Germany has, Italy has, the United States has, most developed countries have, is that housing, education, and healthcare are growing faster than wages. So when my grandfather came over from Ireland, he came from Galway at 16 years old, he was a janitor. So that meant that he cleaned toilets for a living. So my grandfather cleaned toilets for a living, and he owned his own house. And he wasn't worried if his daughter, who turned out to be my mother, got sick, he could take her to the doctors, and he wasn't worried about the bill. He wasn't worried about saving money to educate his daughter, which turned out to be my mother. A janitor today in America can't buy a house. If a janitor is married to another janitor, the 2 of them together can't buy a house, they have to rent. So housing has grown, the cost of housing has grown faster than wages. That is a big problem, because what gives a man or a woman dignity is coming home to something that you own and putting your little feet in your own backyard and knowing that that's yours, and if you lose your job, you're not going to lose your house because you own it. If you lose your job and you're paying rent, you don't pay your rent, you're out in the street. So if you can't afford health care, if you can't afford to educate your kids, if you can't afford housing, you lose your dignity. And when a man or a woman loses their dignity, lots of bad things happen. In America, and lots of you weren't born in America, but I can tell you, America is the country of hopes and dreams. America is not about Wall Street. America is not about Silicon Valley. America is the country of hopes and dreams. Those hopes and dreams go away if you have no dignity. If you can't afford a home, if you can't afford to educate your kids, if you can't afford health care, you lose your dignity. And what's happening now is the left is blaming the right and saying it's all big business's fault. The right is blaming the left and saying it's all government's fault, and they're both lies. It's not all business's fault. Business is what makes the world work. It's what made the elevator work that got us up here. It's what makes the air conditioner work. It's what makes this food available. It's what makes this microphone work. Business is not all evil. Government is not all evil. Government has gotten too big, and it's gotten too divisive. Business has gotten too big. Too many people are making too much money, and the divide between the haves and the have-nots have gotten too big, and business has to fix that problem. This public-private partnership we were just talking about in Ireland to bring national broadband to Ireland is the first of size, of scale, public-private partnership in England and Ireland together this year, and there was one other one last year. 5 years ago, there would be 20 or 25 a year. They don't exist anymore because Government doesn't trust business, and business doesn't like government. So is this fight that goes on. When I was first out of college, I worked for an Irish-American politician by the name of Tip O'Neill. He was Speaker of the House, and my little cubicle was right outside his office. And when he would come back from the floor, I'd say, "Mr. Speaker, how'd we do today?" And he'd always say, "Davey, we got half. Davey, we got half." And to him, half was good enough. That construct is gone in American politics. When George Bush the first was in the Congress, he served under two administrations, a Republican one and a Democratic one. Both times he voted 50-50. He voted with the administration when it was a Democratic administration, when he was a Republican half the time, and when he was in a Republican administration, he voted half the time. That no longer happens in America. It's 98%, 99% to 1. So that fighting won't solve any of the problems. And the problem as business people that you have in front of you is that the problem is not going away. People have decided it's a war between the left and the right, and businesses are going to be under attack. And if the businesses don't solve it, someone like Elizabeth Warren will solve it for you, and it won't be good. It won't be good. So businesses have to solve these problems themselves. So in the UK, so I was in the UK a couple weeks ago in the Labour Party, which would be equivalent to our Democratic Party, basically, had their their committee meeting where they decide their platform for the year, right? So one of the things in their platform that they decided was the Eaton Act, right? Which is that the private schools they should get rid of all the private schools. So 15 to 20% of the education is private schools, 85% in public schools. So they've decided that the haves, they should get rid of the school systems that work, as opposed to fixing the systems that don't work. So that's like someone coming to your office and saying, "Boss, I got a great idea. I got 20% of our products that are selling, 80% that aren't. So we're going to get rid of these 20% that are working." I mean, it's a ridiculous concept, but it feeds into the narrative of someone else has it, so we should take it away, because that's easy, as opposed to let's take what's working in those 20%, apply it in a cost-effective way to the 80% that's not working. The problem with that is it's hard. It takes leadership. It takes guts. It takes determination. It takes people working together. Just saying we're going to get rid of all the private schools because there's too many haves, the haves have something and the have-nots don't have it, so we'll just take it away. That just causes more fighting. In tonight's the Democratic debate, one of the many Democratic debates on TV, and I watched them a couple weeks ago on CNN, and you would hear someone say, "We're going to be carbon neutral by 2025. So the next person would get up and say, "We're going to be carbon neutral by 2020. So they just sort of make up stuff because they realize that if you go back years ago, politicians used to have to basically deliver on what they said. And if you go back to the 30s with FDR came up with the New Deal, which was in America something to help us recover from the Great Recession and a Depression. And he started putting all these safety nets in place, which were very needed and helpful. And he got elected a record, 4 times, right? Got elected a record 4 times, and they changed the rules that you can't be president for more than 2 terms now. So every politician after that realized if you give stuff away, you get reelected. Then, when you take yourself into about the 70s, politicians started realizing you don't actually have to do it. You just have to say you're going to do it. So you don't actually have to do anything. You just have to say, "I'm going to do something." And now, you don't actually even have to say you're going to do anything. You just have to say, "I'm going to undo what the other person did because it was bad." So it's gotten totally bizarre. Like no business that any of you work in would possibly function with a setup like that. It wouldn't possibly, no one could walk into your office and say, you know, we're going to be profitable, this division is going to be profitable by 2025, and someone else comes in and says, well, I want that job, I can do it by 2020, and then you'd say, well, how? And if the person just had a dumb look on their face, you know, you wouldn't take them serious. But with politicians, you actually get elected by just doing those things. In the lies of, we've institutionalized the lying, so we say things that we know we can't do. You know, Medicare for all is $3.3 trillion. We can't afford that. The United States is a big country. Our entire revenue is $3.5 trillion. We spend $4.5 trillion, but that means we spend $1 trillion more than we bring in. So you can't just add another $3.3 trillion. And it doesn't solve the problem anyway. Healthcare is too expensive. So my brother, who died of type 1 diabetes, which is the type of diabetes that you're born with, right? So he got diagnosed when he was 6 years old. So my mother, who just recently died, when I was cleaning some papers at her apartment, we found, actually my son and I were cleaning out the papers, we found a piece of paper where my brother was in the hospital, and the best hospital in Boston, Deaconess Hospital, which is still there today, and it was 15 cents a day for this insulin treatment. So I put that into my iPhone. What would that be today? And it'd be about $43 a month today with inflation. Now, insulin's been around since the 1920s, and technology should lower the cost of everything. So it should be $43. Surprisingly, in the UK, it's about $43. In Europe, rest of Europe, it's about $43. In Canada, it's about $43 a month. In America, it's $450 a month. So it's $450 a month in America. That's the problem. And if your kid, like my mother's son, would die without insulin, it's against the law to drive to Canada to buy it for $43. You can drive to Canada and buy all the beer you want, but you can't buy insulin, even if your kid is going to die from lack of insulin. So it's $450. And I'm not, like a lot of you are probably in the healthcare business, but the healthcare industry in America was $50 billion last year. 10 companies made half of that. 9 of them were pharma companies. Okay? Biogen, a company a couple miles away from where I grew up, did $3.5 billion $11 billion in revenue last year, $3.5 billion in profit. That's 3 times more than the S&P 500. That's 4 times more than the oil and gas. It's 2.5 times more than my industry. That's a lot of money to make. So the problem is not in spending another $3 trillion to give Medicare for all. The problem is we have to bring healthcare down so it's affordable. We have to bring housing down so it's affordable, which means we have to figure out how to resurrect rural Ireland, rural America, rural UK. We have to create a sustainable, my little village in Ireland. So when I bought the house there roughly 18 years ago, since then, we've lost the post office. Since then, we've lost the police station. Since then, we've lost the only good restaurant in the village. Since then, we've lost 3 pubs. So if it's not sustainable to live there, it's really, really, really hard to make people feel good about their lives if they're in a dying village. We have to give them connectivity, which is one thing we have to do, but then we have to figure out how to educate them through technology and how to employ them through technology. And those things take a long time, and they're hard, and it takes real leadership. That's the problem. The politicians don't want to have to deal with that because it takes a long time and it's difficult. Healthcare has to come down, technology can do it. Education's the easiest one. Education is when I was cleaning my mom's house, I also found my father's, my father and I went to the same college, Georgetown, and I found his tuition bill. So dollar to dollar, inflation adjusted, it's about 5 times more expensive now, even with adjusted for inflation as it was. So it's become unaffordable, but that one will get solved very rapidly with technology. The education one I'm not really worried about because technology will solve. The first time Goldman Sachs, Citibank, Mutual of America, America. First time these companies start hiring someone that got their education online, makes the front page of the New York Times, makes the front page of the Wall Street Journal, makes the front page of the Financial Times, and then that ball starts rolling downhill very fast. That solves that problem. But in the educational industry won't fight hard because it's old and big and slow. Bringing down healthcare will be much harder because someone making $3.5 billion a year will fight very, very hard. Will fight very hard for the status quo. Now, what we did, by the way, as a country, is we gave the two founders of that company the Nobel Prize. So that's how we are. To me, it just seems like an excessive profit. That's my view, and that's the view of most people. That profits in corporate America is getting globally. Corporations are getting too big and taking too much from the community and not putting enough back in. So that has to be solved. In the housing, the only way you're going to solve that is to build houses in rural areas. And the only reason anybody's going to live in a rural area is if there's jobs and it's sustainable. That's hard. That takes leadership. Anyway, so I wrote the book in hopes that people smarter than me can solve these problems for my kids and for my grandkids, because there's brass in that muck. There's money to be made by solving those problems for people that want to make a lot of money. For people who want to live an interesting life, it's interesting problems to solve. It's far more interesting to solve those problems than to design another widget to sell that someone doesn't need, or to sell something that's not going to affect anybody's life. You can really affect people's lives by solving those three big problems: healthcare, education, and housing. So you can live an interesting life, you can solve interesting problems, and you can keep your company from being attacked, which is going to happen. And you're going to wake up every day running these companies feeling like you're in the Coliseum just waiting for the lions to come in if these problems don't get solved. So that's why I wrote the book. I hope you're inspired to solve some of these problems. Thank you all very much.